Hey, what's up guys, Sir Emanon here, and welcome to what's going to be part 1 of a very complete and in-depth guide to the Kashtira deck. So if you've been following along with the OCG trends, you'll know that the deck actually got quite a solid wave of support in the Photon Hypernova set, which we'll be getting here in the TCG in a few months' time in February of next year. And these cards are really strong. They definitely propelled the deck to metagame contention, and the deck now kind of stands as the premier anti-meta threat to Tearlaments, which is still the OCG's best deck, despite it getting hit, and I imagine similar trends will follow suit here once we get those cards in the TCG. So understandably, there's a lot of hype around Kashtira, and I'm going to go over the cards in this video very much in depth and provide some sample deck lists. And then in some follow-up videos, we'll be talking about some combos as well as specific rulings and tips and tricks to keep in mind, as well as specific matchup dynamics. So stay tuned for those. But like I mentioned, there's quite a lot to discuss here, so let's not waste any time and get started here without any further ado. So if you are unfamiliar with the Kashtira deck's playstyle and its win condition, basically there are two core gameplay mechanics that are central to its strategy. So the first one is banishing your opponent's cards face down from different locations and through different effects. And the second is that when it does banish your opponent's cards, it uses the boss monster Shangri-La to eventually lock out your opponent's main monster zones and render them unable to summon anything. And to get a better understanding of how this kind of functions and how these cards operate, I think it's important to go over the Xyz monsters first. So the first one is going to be Shangri-La. I know that's called Shangri-Ira in the TCG, but it's based off of Shangri-La, and also it's easier for me to say Shangri-La, so I'm just going to refer to it as such in these videos. But anyways, this is a generic rank 7 psychic Xyz monster that requires 2+ materials, and it has 3 very powerful effects. So the first one is a trigger that happens during each standby phase, where you can special summon any Kashtira from your deck. And that's actually the only hard once per turn on this card. The other 2 effects are not once per turn. So the second effect is another trigger, where each time a card or cards your opponent owns and possesses is banished face down from anywhere, you can choose an unused main monster zone or spell and trap zone on the field, and it can't be used while this monster is face up. And the final effect is just some generic protection, where if it be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can detach with material instead. So a lot to unpack here. The first effect is very solid in terms of maintaining advantage and accruing you resources. If you are at all familiar with the currently legal cards out of the archetype that came out in Darkwing Blast in the main deck, those being Fenrir, Unicorn, and the Ogre, these all generally double as searchers as well as ways to interrupt your opponent through some means. So being able to pick and choose which ones you can access during either player's turn, both your turn and your opponent's, is a very powerful effect. This card's also pretty hard to out just because it has a huge defense stat and its final effect being protection. So your opponent has to kind of jump through certain hoops to deal with it, either through like their own Fenrir in the mirror match or something like a Collider Heart in like the Tearlaments matchup, for instance. But yeah, this card is kind of a pain, and if it sticks around for more than one turn, it's going to get you so many cards that you'll just eventually overwhelm your opponent in advantage. So that's one big benefit of this card. But the second effect, of course, is the one that I think most people are familiar with, the one that makes this deck kind of notorious and what is very appealing, and that is the zone lockout effect. So it might seem a bit innocuous at first glance, just locking out one zone at a time, but upon further inspection, a lot of the 2 and 3 card setup combos on the first turn can actually lock out your opponent's, or 3 of your opponent's main monster zones on your turn 1. And then if your opponent performs any action, if you have both this card and Rise Heart and Diablosis on board, which is a lot of the standard end board combos, you'll actually be able to lock out all 5 of your opponent's zones as soon as your opponent does anything. So it's actually a lot easier than it might initially seem to block out 5 zones, provided of course your combo goes through. And this adds added benefit, or the added benefit of being able to choose any zone, being a monster zone or a spell and trap zone, depending on what the situation calls for. So against certain decks like Pendulum, this has a fantastic time. And this card, again, being very hard to out, is sort of a lingering background threat. It's something that your opponent has to deal with it eventually, but they also have to deal with the kind of more present active threats that'll hinder your opponent's plays immediately. Things like the quick effect banish effect of a Rise Heart or Fenrir, for instance. So this card is kind of a looming threat, something that your opponent will eventually have to deal with, or it gets out of hand really quickly, and then your opponent will suddenly find themselves just unable to do anything. Also, another reason why this card is extremely irritating for your opponent is a very specific ruling on how this works versus effect negation. So MistysDad actually covered this very well and in depth on his channel, so definitely check out his rulings video on Kashtira if you haven't already. But essentially, if this card has already resolved to lock out some number of zones, and then later on it gets hit with a negation effect through something like Dark Ruler or Impermanence or Tearlaments Celiac, what ends up happening is that these zones are still going to be locked. And the reason for that is that this card actually places a condition on the field where as long as it remains face up, those zones will be unusable. So in order for your opponent to kind of combat this and to out this card, they can't use negation afterwards. They have to actually either just get rid of it entirely by removing it from the field or by booking it face down through a card like Book of Eclipse, which we'll get to later on. But this card, again, is very, very annoying for your opponent to deal with, and even though it's not public enemy number 1 usually, it is going to be something that your opponent will have to address, otherwise they will be locked out of the game completely. So that was quite a lot to discuss. The next disease monster is just as bloated in terms of card text. So this is the Arise Heart, one of the cards we're getting in Photon Hypernova. In fact, all the OCG cards are out of that set. So this is another generic rank 7 Xyz monster that requires 3 materials, but it does have an alternate summoning condition where if Shangri-La activated its effects this turn, you can Xyz summon Arise Heart once per turn by using any Kashtira monster you control. So if you use a main deck monster, any of these guys, you can go ahead and just overlay this kind of similar to a Zodiac Xyz monster, or you can use another copy of itself even, or a Shangri-La, and just simply transfer the materials over to this card. It's a walking macrocosmos where any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead, and it has 2 additional effects that are both very powerful. The first is that once per chain, each time a card is banished, you attach any banished card to this card's material, and then once per turn as a quick effect, you can detach 3 materials from this card to target any card in the field and banish it face down. So again, quite a lot to discuss here. The first effect actually is a bit more noteworthy in terms of its wording than it might initially seem. So this card actually does not specify whose Shangri-La has to activate, nor does it specify which effect has to activate for this condition to be met. Which means that specifically in the mirror match, if your opponent uses the Shangri-La to summon a Kashtira from their deck, you can actually go ahead and summon a Rise Heart straight away if you just, for example, summon a Fenrir and then go into this immediately. You can also use cards like Mind Control, a Change of Heart, things that change control like Triple Tactics Talent, take one of their monsters and then overlay this on top of it. So it makes this a pretty reliable out to your opponent's board depending on what cards you have access to, and this is definitely something to kind of think about when playing in the mirror match. But even outside of the mirror match, this is important to understand because in the Photon Hypernova set, we're getting a aptly named Tearlaments Kashtira. So this card is a member of both archetypes, of course, meaning that it is searchable by various different means through both archetypes. And this being played in the Tearlaments deck, as it has mill effects, is very, very problematic if your opponent decides to splash in a copy of this into their extra deck, because they can simply just summon this onto their field and then go into an Arise Heart, and then they can start breaking apart your board if they have enough ways to kind of utilize this to their advantage. Or they can use this to go into like a Zeus, for instance. So a lot of things to kind of think about. There's even like some OCG deck lists that were experimenting with a larger Kashtira package. Most of the standard package is just some number of Fenrir, Tearlaments Kashtira, and the field spell. But other players are playing around with like, even Unicorn and Birth in the Tearlaments strategy to even hard summon this card. So there's definitely ways that this card can be splashed into other strategies, and it's something to definitely consider. But the most important thing to note is that it can be any Kashtira Shangri-La effect, and either player is one at that. So very, very important to kind of consider. The second effect, I think, is the most straightforward one. It's simply just a macrocosmos, and is the reason why this deck is pretty well positioned against, or one of the reasons why this deck is well positioned against the Tearlaments strategy. And even against other rogue decks that rely on their graveyard, they're going to have a hard time outing this because, again, it has huge stats and is just overall a big nuisance. But the third effect, I think, is one of the more interesting ones, being the once per chain trigger effect. So the first thing to understand here is that this is actually mandatory, meaning that it's really easy actually for either player to miss this because it'll happen on a new chain as a trigger effect. So kind of similar to cards like Fenrir and Unicorn and like Ogre here, where their effects are actually trigger effects, so they activate on a new chain. This operates very similarly. So anytime a card is getting banished, which is all of them thanks to the macro effect, you'll have to activate this in a new chain to attach a banished card to it as material. And so it gets pretty annoying to kind of keep track of. There are a lot of OCG mirror matches that I've watched of the Kashtira deck where players sometimes just forget to use this. So you definitely don't want to be forgetting this, both if you're playing this deck and if you're playing against it. So just make sure to keep that in mind. It also still activates even if it gets negated because it is mandatory, so it does play into cards like Talents very much. But another thing to think about is whose cards can be attached, which is anyone's, and what type of card can be attached, which is anything. So face up or face down cards are all fair game. And there's a lot of kind of annoying nuances regarding which face down banish cards on your opponent's side of the field are like designatable and identifiable. That is deserving of its entire video by itself, or at least in like a section of the rulings video that I plan on doing. But basically, there are certain cards that can be banished face down through other effects that you can identify specifically as I want to take this card. And other times you can't identify it, which is definitely a big pain. And it's going to be very, very sticky if those situations do come up. So that's something that I do want to highlight later on, and I'll definitely get to that in a later video, which deserves more dedicated attention. But in any case, this still is a very powerful effect. One of the things that you'll be utilizing the most is the fact that the new spell and trap have utility effects when they get banished. So oftentimes that you'll be banishing these through some means through your engine, and then you'll be reattaching them through the Rise Heart attach effect. And then once you detach for its last effect as a quick effect, you can get these back to the banish zone since this thing is still a macrocosmos on board. And these things will be able to trigger again, getting you extra resources to your hand or onto your field. So very, very good for being able to not only disrupt your opponent, you can make your opponent's cards kind of be held hostage under this card forever, but you can also just make sure that your cards are going to be continuously looped in ways that are beneficial to you. And the last effect is also pretty straightforward, just simple disruption. One thing to note is that it banishes face down, which means it triggers the effect of Shangri-La to actually lock out your opponent's zones. So these cards work very well hand in hand as they are designed to. And so there is a lot of ways to be able to use this to your advantage. And you can even banish your own cards face down if you need to in a pinch. Not really sure why you would do that. Actually, there are potential scenarios where you want to do that. For example, if you have like the trap and the spell underneath and you want to just get materials banished, if this is about to be negated by like a top decked Imprim or something, maybe that's something that you might want to do. So yeah, there definitely are considerations for this, and there's a lot to keep in mind between both this and the Shangri-La. The final Xyz monster that I want to go over first before covering the main deck is number 89, Diabolos the Mind Hacker, which might as well be an honorary Kashtira monster. But this is another generic rank 7, which has 3 effects. So the first one is an ignition effect, where you can detach a material from this card and basically Ghost Reaper your opponent, but the monster gets banished face down. And so that is, of course, very debilitating for strategies that rely on specific extra deck monsters. It now forces Tearlaments to play multiple Kikalis at least, and even some OCG players are choosing to run multiple copies of Kaleidoheart, because that's like the typical backup plan. If you can only banish one card from your opponent's extra deck and you choose Kaleidoheart, it limits some of their removal tools, especially for cards like Shangri-La, which have protection from battle and card effect destruction. But it doesn't stop there. There's 2 other effects that are very important as well. The second one doesn't come up as much, but it's still useful to know, which is at the end of the battle phase, if this card destroyed a monster by battle, you can target any card in their graveyard and banish it face down. And then finally, the effect that kind of ties this whole thing together is if a card your opponent owns and possesses is banished face down while you control this card, you can banish cards from the top of your opponent's extra deck face down equal to the number of their face down banished cards. And so this actually can trigger off of the first ignition effect and the second trigger effect as well, where if you can banish anything face down by any means, you get to go ahead and banish more cards face down. And this works extremely well, again, with the Shangri-La, because each time that happens in a new chain, your Shangri-La will be able to trigger, and it can lock an additional zone. So notably, this can proc basically 2 of the Shangri-La effects by itself in a singular turn on your turn. And at any time you're banishing opponent's cards on either player's turn, the trigger effect will still happen. So typically, when I mentioned before that you can lock out all 5 of your opponent's main monster zones by their turn 1, you'll be able to lock out 1 zone by a combo that is native to the archetype. And then 2 more are from both of the Diabolos effects, both the first ignition effect and the final trigger effect. And then on your opponent's turn, when your opponent does anything, you can use the Rise Heart to banish that face down. And then that triggers the Diabolos effect to banish cards from the top of their deck face down. So in total, that's 5, and that is how you can quickly just banish or lock out all 5 of their zones. And it is really, really hard for your opponent to deal with if they don't have a specific answer to this. So they have to come very prepared with ways to pretty much deal with this. And it's nice by banishing your opponent's extra deck face down, because it makes it that cards like Tearlaments Crime can't just simply grab back Kikalis, unlike actual Ghost Reaper. So that's definitely something to think about. But yeah, this card, it pretty much works hand in hand with the rest of the deck. So again, that's why it might as well just be a Kashtira monster at this point. But that's about it for the Xyz monsters, at least the main ones. That was a lot to go over, so let's go ahead and run through the main deck now and how those cards kind of facilitate this strategy. So the first one is Fenrir. I think the majority of you watching probably already know what this card does. It's very straightforward, and a lot of these cards are actually pretty simple in terms of the main deck. But Fenrir has a special summon condition where if you control no monsters, you can summon this card without activating from your hand. And it has two other effects. So the first one is an ignition during your main phase, where you can activate any Kashtira monster or add any Kashtira monster from your deck to your hand. So in most decks where you're just splashing 3 of this, you're adding another copy of itself. But in this deck, you're seldom doing that. You're usually just going to actually go for other extenders that this deck has to keep making plays and to keep pushing. So it's very nice to be able to just activate and have a searcher for the entire archetype. And then if this card, or when this card declares an attack, or if your opponent activates a monster effect except during the damage step, you can target a face-up card your opponent controls and banish it face down. So obviously this is kind of the primary disruption from the main deck. It works really well in tandem with like other effects of this deck, but this is one that you'll typically be fetching with a Shangri-La or be summoning from underneath your Xyz monsters through the Big Bang. And it is obviously one of the best cards in the deck. Not too much to explain about this one. People already know how good Fenrir is. Unicorn, however, is kind of the start of the show when it comes to the Kashtira deck specifically. It's the one-card playmaker because Fenrir oftentimes requires other cards to combo with it, but Unicorn can do it all by itself. And this card has the same summoning condition as Fenrir, and it also has the same ignition effect during the main phase, except it adds spells instead of monsters. And the spells are really, really powerful. They are pretty much what you keep playing through certain disruptions or just extend your board. They have an E-Telly and they have a double summon that also is Reborn or DDR. So a lot of ways to get additional board presence by itself. And then the same conditions apply where the third effect can go ahead and activate as long as your opponent declares an attack, or if they activate a monster effect. When this card declares an attack, or if your opponent activates a monster effect. But this one allows you to look at your opponent's extra deck and banish a monster from it face down. So it's another Ghost Reaper-esque type of effect, where in combination with a copy of DtheSecond can actually rip through your opponent's extra deck really, really fast. And it also makes it so that hand trapping this card or activating a hand trap while this card's on the field can be very detrimental for your opponent if they're not careful. So things like Havness or like Ash Blossom on Papias, which is a very popular kind of hand trap spot. Oftentimes this will already be on board, which means that they'll have to think about exchanging a card from their extra deck to activate a hand trap essentially. So this is also one of the better kind of disruption tools in tandem with the Fenrir. And so you can get a lot of usage out of this and the DtheSecond to be able to kind of rip apart your opponent's strategy and make it very hard for them to play. The next one is Riseheart. This is one of the best extenders of the deck, and it's one that effectively replaces Psybeast, which is what current TCG Kashtira builds are doing in terms of its function. It's part of the archetype, so it's easier to access as well. But this is a level 4 Fire Warrior monster with 1500 attack and 21 defense, so it's kind of like a Rhinoheart or the Scareclaw Reichheart in terms of stat line and lore and stuff. But anyways, this is an extender where if you control a Kashtira monster, you can special summon this card from your hand, but you get Xyz locked for the rest of the turn from the extra deck. And then during the main phase, if this card was normally special summoned this turn, you can banish any Kashtira card from your deck as a cost besides itself, and then banish the top 3 cards of your opponent's extra deck face down, and if you do, it becomes level 7. So this card is one of the special summons that doesn't require you to control no monsters. So it's very much a way to be able to play 3 hand traps if you already hard open this card, for example. This card also being able to banish your opponent's cards face down means that it's actually the only main deck monster that can trigger the Shangri-La effect without relying on your opponent in doing something, which is what Fenrir and Unicorn would require you to do, or would require to happen rather. So Riseheart is extremely solid in that regard, and it's a way to immediately turn on the summoning condition of a Riseheart in the process. So this card is extremely vital and pivotal to actually make sure it resolves. But this card is very, very solid. There's not a whole lot to talk about beyond that, because typically after using that, you'll be using it as Xyz material because it doesn't really have any other disruption type effects. Notably, it Xyz locks you, so definitely keep that in mind, as well as the fact that it can only activate if it was normal or special summoned to this turn. So there's a lot of ways you can summon the Kashtira monsters from your deck or elsewhere on your opponent's turn, whether it be through the Shangri-La standby phase effect, or say like the trap, for instance. But yeah, it has to be summoned to that turn to be able to activate that effect to level modulate and to banish from your opponent's deck face down. So be sure to remember that. But that's about it for this card. The next two are extenders that are very, very similar, being Scareclaw and Tearlaments Kashtira. It's kind of annoying that these cards' names are pretty much just archetypes jammed together, but that's just naming conventions, I guess. But anyways, both of these have the same summoning condition where during the main phase as a quick effect, you can special summon them from your hand, and if you do, you banish a Kashtira or a card from their respective archetypes from your hand or graveyard. And then they have other additional bonus effects. Scareclaw is basically a super heavy samurai where it can attack while in face-up defense position and applies its defense for damage calculation. And it also has an effect where it negates any opponent's monster that battles a Kashtira or a Scareclaw monster until the end of the turn. So this is actually useful for getting over a card like Baguska, because you can just summon this and then you can attack the Baguska and then just go to main phase 2 and keep playing. So it's nice to be able to out that card, just kind of like that. The effect negation is also one that might not come up a lot, but it is something that's useful to keep in mind. It doesn't negate graveyard effects notably, but it does negate monsters that are just on the field that are battling this card. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Tearlaments Kashtira, on the other hand, has other effects that are more congruent to the Tearlaments strategy. So on summon, this can mill either player to top 3 cards of their deck. So you can see why this is a very strong card in Tearlaments. And also, if this card is sent to the grave by a card effect, it additionally can mill 2 more. So this card is, you know, a very, very strong addition to the Tearlaments strategy, but also can be useful in this deck as well, because if you have an Arise Heart on board, or if Shifter is being applied or something like that, you can actually go ahead and try and banish cards from your deck to fuel your engine for something like Birth or Papias or things like that. So there are some niche cases where you can actually activate the effect. But basically, these are both extenders. You typically play 1 to maybe 2 copies of these. A lot of the current ratios of the OCG are playing 1 and 1. Whereas Unicorn and Fenrir are generally 3 ofs, and Rise Heart is generally a 2 to 3 of. So yeah, these are kind of like the additional extenders that are nice to draw in the cases where like you do get hand trapped, or if you want to end on a slightly bigger board turn 1. But they're not play starters by themselves, so you don't really want to max on these a whole lot. But still very solid cards. Next up is Planet Parizos, the new planet card where I guess Visa Starfrost is visiting. On activation, this card can add any Kashtira monster from your deck to your hand, and then has an attack boost effect where, or attack and defense boost effect where monsters you control gain 100 attack and defense for each attribute on the field. So this boosts any monster on your board, notably not just Kashtiras, and also counts both players' attributes. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. And then if a Kashtira Shangri-La you control activates its effect, except during the damage step, you can target a card in the field and destroy it. So that one is the one that maybe comes up the least in terms of the pop effect, at least in comparison to a card like Perla Rhino. But it still is a nice kind of bonus if you ever do find yourself in that position where you're locking out a zone and then popping a card off the Parizos. Very solid, but this, for the most part, is just a consistency tool. Not really a whole lot to say. The next one is Kashtira Papias. I read this as Papayas when I first saw this card, which I thought was funny. But this is the Italy of the deck. So you target a Kashtira monster you control, and then you special summon a Kashtira monster from your deck with a different attribute in defense position, and then you exceed slot from the extra deck for the turn. If this card becomes banished, you can target a banished Kashtira card and add to your hand besides itself. So this card is very, very solid, of course. It's one of the primary search targets off of Unicorn. Usually, if you don't have either of the spells, you add this one first. Notably, it does have to check the monster's attribute on resolution. So if your target leaves the field before this gets to resolve, it won't be able to summon anything. And that's important to think about in like the mirror match, for example. Like if they have an Arise Heart on board and like you're trying to summon Unicorn, activate effect to go ahead and add Papias, and you target the Unicorn and they chain to banish this face down. This would just simply resolve, but won't summon anything. So things to keep in mind. Also, it's not like you can go for games super easily just because it summons in defense position, and also locks you into Exceed similar to Rise Heart. But this card is a staple 3 of in this deck. It's one that you want to open for sure, and it's one of the ways you can just access any of your monsters essentially. One thing also to keep in mind is that Rise Heart is the same attribute as Shangri-La, meaning that you can't target Shangri-La and then summon a copy of Rise Heart from your main deck. So kind of small things to think about there, similar to like Tearlaments Kashtira and Ogre both being water. These like rarely matter, but in the rare event that they do, it is something to think about. Oh, I guess Scareclaw and Fenrir also share the same attribute. But in most situations, you will be able to resolve this fairly reliably, fairly easily. The next card is Kashtira Birth. This is the continuous spell that's actually currently legal for Darkwing Blast, and has 3 different effects, all of which are quite good. So the first one allows you to normal summon level 7 monsters without tributing, and that's not just Kashtira monsters, meaning that you might see some players talk about other random, like generic good level 7 monsters that you can summon without tributing, which we'll kind of talk about later, but that's a very useful effect to have. And then it has a ignition effect during the main phase, where you can special summon any non-Xyz Kashtira monster that's banished or in your graveyard. And if your opponent activates a spell card or effect while this card's on the field and you control a Kashtira monster, you target 3 cards in your opponent's graveyard and banish them face down. So these effects are very, very solid. The ability to Reborn or DDR is really good at extending past hand traps or just getting your follow-up plays. Is able to go ahead and just extend your board and make it bigger if you, like, say, for example, already opened Papias and you can just grab this card. And the other effect of the spell card activation and banishing 3 cards in your opponent's graveyard is interesting. It doesn't come up a whole ton, but notably it's good specifically against Tearlaments Scream, because Scream will be able to mill them 3 if they summon. And if this is on board, you can actually just target any 3 after that chain resolves. So you can hit any of the tiers that they hit, or like any of their shufflers, for example, and you can go ahead and just take care of those right away. Notably, that has to target exactly 3 cards, not up to 3. So if your opponent doesn't have enough engraved, then you can't actually activate this effect at all. But this card is typical at 2 copies. Some people play 3 of it. There's arguments to both. It's not a play starter by itself, and it's not like a huge extender in the form of Papias, but it is one of the best cards to just have lingering on the board, because kind of similar to Shangri-La, like if they don't deal with this card, if they don't deal with Birth, then you'll just be getting free bodies every single turn, just for very little effort. So I do think this is a very powerful card for sure. It's definitely played at least at 2 in most lists. The final card that is very standard in the Kashtira lineup is the Big Bang. This is a normal trap which has 2 effects, one of which is much more relevant than the other. The first effect is if a Kashtira Xyz monster is on the field, you can make both players banish monsters from their field face down so they only control 1. And then the second effect is if it's banished, you can target a Kashtira Xyz monster you control and add any Kashtira monster you own attached to it to your hand and then special summon it from your hand. So both of those are once per turn effects. And the on-field effect is actually not that relevant. Typically this card is considered a brick. You want to generally banish this card off of the Rise Heart. So typically what you're going to be doing is you're going to be getting level 7 bodies on the board, enough for them to go into a Shangri-La. And then you'll summon the Rise Heart afterwards, and then you'll go Rise Hearts to banish the Big Bang, to go ahead and banish 3 from the top of the deck face down, and then change it to level 7. And this triggers the Big Bang to go ahead and play or special summon one of the attached monsters under the Shangri-La after adding it to your hand. And then you can go ahead and, now that you fulfilled the condition for the Shangri-La, since you banish cards face down and you presumably just locked out a zone, you can go ahead and summon a Rise Heart and keep playing from there. So this is one that you don't really want to be drawing in most cases. If you do draw, it's not the end of the world because the Scareclaw and the Tearlaments Kashtira can just banish it out of your hand. And worst case scenario, you can actually just set it and treat it as kind of a mini evenly matched. Although a lot of the times you're losing your own stuff as well, since your board is going to be somewhat big with the Xyz monsters, as well as summoning like a Fenrir during standby, for instance. So this is not like a great card to be activating on board, but it can come up. But most notably, this card is extremely good in terms of being able to go ahead and just get you more resources that are underneath your existing Kashtira monsters. What's important to note is this and Papias, like I mentioned earlier with the Rise Heart, are kind of the ones you want to be looping. So because Papias allows you to go ahead and add back banished Kashtira cards, and this allows you to effectively summon one from underneath any of your Xyz monsters, you want to be attaching them constantly with the Rise Heart and then detaching them for the banish effect. That way you can keep cycling these every single turn, and that's generally how this deck can also win the grind game if you don't manage to stick something like a Birth on board. So yeah, these cards work all very well in tandem, and these are like the standard ones that pretty much every single Kashtira list plays to some extent. Like they might not play the Tearlament one, or they might not play the Scareclaw one, like they might choose between one or the other. But for the most part, these are played to some capacity. The other ones to talk about are Ogre and Preparations. These are ones that I think are actually underexplored and have a lot of potential to be good, especially in certain situations. So Ogre is similar to Fenrir and Unicorn in terms of its summoning condition, has the exact same one, and then it adds a Kashtira trap from your deck to your hand in the main phase instead of a spell or a monster. And the trigger effect is a bit weaker in comparison to, say, Fenrir or Unicorn, but it still is pretty useful. When you declare an attack with this card, or if your opponent activates a monster effect, you can activate up to 5 cards on the top of their deck, and then banish one of them face down, and place the rest on top in the same order. So just a little bit more disruption on the front of disrupting their deck, which, with Rise Heart as well as Diabolis, you can actually banish quite a lot of their cards from their deck. But the reason this is decent is because this can actually add the Preparations, which is a pretty solid card. It's a continuous trap where during either player's turn, you can special summon any Kashtira monster that is banished in your hand. And then if your opponent activates a trap card or effect and you control a Kashtira monster while this is already face up, you go to your opponent's hand, and if you do, you can banish a card from your face down. So the reason why this is potentially just an option to consider is that this card actually helps you play around a card like Dark Ruler, because even though your zones, you're still going to lock your opponent's zones out if you get Dark Rulered. Typically, by that point, if they do a first action, they're not going to have all 5 of their zones locked. And a deck like Tearlaments can actually utilize 2 of their main monster zones and their extra monster zone decently reliably. So if you do have that happen, or like if you get Book of Cups, for instance, this can help you kind of still maintain some board presence, at least. And additionally, it's actually nice against certain instances, like if they mill a Seljuk or a Crime or something, and you have this already face up, you can actually disrupt their hand, which is pretty useful to get hand knowledge. So you'll see most builds typically play 0 this card, but there is an argument to maybe play 1-1. Or you can even consider siding these cards if you run into a lot of ways that people might remove your board, which is pretty common. So yeah, that's it for the main Kashtira stuff. Next, I'm just gonna talk about some techs. I'm not gonna explain these super in depth because I feel like this video is probably already getting too long as is. But first are some existing TCG techs that are pretty popular in current builds. So we have Psybeast, which is essentially a worse version of Rise Heart. So I don't really see people playing this card post Photon Hypernova. But it's essentially the same thing, except this actually banishes for cost as well, which is very nice. And then there's Astral Karibo, the Ascendant of Thunder, Instant Contact. All of these are basically just ways to get level 7 bodies on the board with various upsides and downsides. You could maybe consider these if you really just want ways to get to Shangri-La through any sort of disruption. Because this deck kind of does have very known quantities of extenders, and your opponent will be able to understand kind of which cards to stop, Papias being one of them, as well as Unicorn Search. People often use their Seljuk on this, for example. So it's very nice to be able to have just additional ways to push past that. The OCG doesn't really play any of these cards in any of the lists that I've seen, but it is definitely something to think about. All of these have, again, advantages or disadvantages, but they accomplish the same purpose of just putting more bodies on board. Sacred Sword of 7 stars is something to think about if you're playing specifically Ascendant of Thunder as well. But it's more draw power. Usually Prosperity is played instead of this card just because digging for your 1-card starters in Unicorn and the Field Spell are more reliable ways to play the game than just trying to draw your way out of it. But being able to fuel your Banish Zone is also not that bad because it works with cards like Birth, for instance. So again, in current lists, this card is fairly popular, but I expect that Prosperity is going to be kind of the prevailing option moving forward once these cards are released. Next up are some generic level 7s that are worth talking about because Birth can just normal summon them without tributing. Pancratops is probably the most common one, and that's just because it's a generically good side deck card that can be accessed, or that can be drawn into rather, and you can summon this if you already have a board of Kashtira monsters later on, so it's not as bad of a card to draw later. This card is definitely one that could see play for sure. It's not one that can be reliably utilized with Birth necessarily because it is at level, or it is at 1, but it is something to definitely think about. Misspelling Apex Avion is another one that people have been discussing just because this is a Omni negation which can be used post-side to be able to deal with cards that break your board. The issue with these cards in general is just that you have to draw them, and typically when you don't draw Birth or Papias, you're searching Papias off of the Unicorn instead of the Birth. And because of that, it makes it really awkward to use these cards sometimes. And then in situations where you need to access Birth to use to just normal summon out Fenrir, which happens sometimes, it can get a bit awkward if you draw too many of these types of cards. Nonetheless, this is still pretty strong. Mechanical Hound is another very interesting one, where if you have no cards in your hand, your opponent cannot activate spell cards. So it's a way to kind of bypass the board breaker type cards being Eclipse and Dark Ruler, things like that. This card's fine, but the issue is that if you play hand traps in your list, it's going to be awkward to fulfill the condition. And by the time you are able to empty your hand, your opponent probably already used their board breaker against you. So you have to kind of deck build more around this card if you want to make use of it. Chaos Hunter is pretty interesting as well. It's one that might be played for like the mirror match, for example, just because this is a card you can just summon onto your board. Or if you're going second and your opponent special summons a monster, you can drop this. This card is definitely very interesting. I'm not sure how popular it's going to be. I haven't really seen Chaos Hunter in any OCG lists, but people have experimented with this card already in the TCG index like Sprite with Mannequin Cat. So this is definitely something to kind of think about as an option to combat like the mirror match or like Flu Wanderers, things like that. But this is definitely a very interesting option. Next up are some other main deck techs and engines. So we have first up the Barrier Statue of the Stormwinds. So this is summonable via Raid Raptor Arsenal Falcon, which is just a generic rank 7, which allows you to detach one to summon any level 4 winged beast monster from your deck. The other effects are not relevant, but the fact that you can summon this thing and protect it with a Rise Heart is kind of something that the OCG does quite a lot. And I will be honest, I'm not a huge fan of this, just because we still have Flu Wanderers, and I think that deck pretty much turbos out Barrier Statue more reliably than this deck does, and also protects it better. Because this deck doesn't really have any insulation against like evenly into like or like a Dark Ruler, whereas that deck can still utilize like Dreaming Town and summon a second copy. Whereas this deck you would probably never want to play more than one of this. But I feel like if you want to play Barrier Statue Control, you would probably just play Flu Wanderers instead of this deck. But it is an option that the OCG players actually do fancy quite a bit. So it is something that you might expect to see. Something that the OCG doesn't do that we might actually see here, though, is the Adventure Package, which I'm pretty interested in, just as a concept, because they have a lot of their Adventure cards limited at this point in time. But this deck doesn't use its normal summon very much, and so you can actually use this very reliably. Griffin Rider happens to be level 7, which is good, and also gives you an Omni Negation to be able to play around cards like Book of Eclipse and such, which is a card I keep bringing up and we'll talk about later. But yeah. These are very, very interesting options, and we might see them being played. I'm not entirely sure if it's going to be the standard, as the package is fairly large to accommodate, and it eats into the non-engine slots. As the Kashtira engine also is quite big, as is. But this is definitely something to kind of watch out for. The next one is the Dynamorphia package, which some OCG players are doing. I think it's less popular than the Barrier Statue, but it is just another way to get like additional boss monsters, mostly just Rexterm. The issue with this engine is that it doesn't really solve the outstanding problems of the Kashtira deck, being that it loses kind of hard to removal, and while you can still have more bodies on board, your opponent can still wipe your board through side deck cards, which this doesn't really help address. It is a strong kind of main deck option, but I think the main deck already has quite a lot of tools, and you can also just submit with hand traps instead. So this is something to think about, but it's not a super popular option, and I don't think it's one of the best choices personally, but again, something to definitely consider. The next ones are kind of the funny ones. So we got Mushroom Man number 2. So a lot of people probably already saw this. It was posted on Reddit a couple of weeks ago, where the idea behind Mushroom Man number 2 is that it is a warrior searchable via Rhoda, because Rhoda can also search the Rise Heart. And so you can basically summon this onto your board, and then during the end phase, it shifts control to your opponent. And then during their standby phase, they take 300 damage. So it locks them out of summoning their Kashtira monsters in the mirror match, and it makes it so that if they summon Rise Heart, they can't go into Donner, which is like the way that they typically link into and clear their board so they can summon more Kashtiras. And additionally, it allows you to have an effect that they will activate, so you can use cards like Fenrir or Unicorn to go ahead and get more value off those. The trigger effects, that is. The issue with this card is that because of the way that the standby phase works, or like the way you can use these types of standby phase effects works, is that they'll be turn player by the time they have this, and so they get the chance to actually use the Mushroom Man number 2 before you can use a card like Shangri-La. And so unless you already have one of these on board, typically like you won't actually be able to summon like the Fenrir, which will get value off of this card activating in the standby phase. And so at that point, basically you'll be using this as like a monster that you can get rid of with like a Rise Heart. But if that's the case, I think that you might as well just play Nightmare Corruptor Ibli, which I think is better. And actually a lot more players have been, in the OCG at least, been testing in the side deck. This card is very similar, and you also can play around cards like Nibiru with this, which is something that, while not popular right now, is a card that is very strong against this deck if it does ever become relevant again. So Ibli is a good way to deal with Nibiru specifically, that Mushroom Man number 2 doesn't do, and this card, you can just gift your opponent a lot earlier. But the idea is still the same. You can actually use this kind of the same way you would Mushroom Man number 2, except this has a bit more utility. And so I think that like this card, if you want to play one of those like shift control attacks, this card is probably better. The Mushroom Man number 2 is certainly funnier. Next one is going to be Alistair. This one I think is the worst package of all of these, simply because even though you have your normal summon available a lot of the time, you actually can't pay Mechabus cost under a Rise Heart because the card has to be sent to the grave specifically. So I wouldn't really play this. I think I saw maybe one list in the OCG try it, but it doesn't seem that good. So I probably wouldn't play this, but I thought it was just worth throwing out here in case somebody was thinking about it. I mean, you could go for the other invoked fusions instead, but it's not the greatest. It's also a little awkward with Shifter if you're going second. If you're going first, it's actually okay if you do this as your first sort of play, provided your graveyard is empty, because you can theoretically do your whole invoked line and then invocation add back Alistair, and then you can Shifter afterwards, but that seems kind of like a pipe dream to have that and this card and also have all of your Kashtira engine online. And they also can't like Prosperity to dig for these cards beforehand. I mean, that being said though, I probably still wouldn't play this card or this engine, but it is something to maybe think about if it ever does come up. Next up is Planet Pathfinder. This one actually is semi-popular in the OCG. I think next to Bear Statue, this is the most popular option. Just as a way to get more consistency online with Parizos, but you can also flex into cards like Necro Valley, which is really good into, of course, the tier matchup. So this can be played at 1, maybe 2 copies, just as a generic way to be able to have engine or non-engine, which I think is pretty solid. Necro Valley is, again, kind of just in tandem with the Pathfinder. And then we have like Shifter, Defissure, and Macro, which I want to touch on briefly, just because a lot of people are discussing, Fissure and Macro going to 3 in the TCG on the most recent ban list, which is effective. Should be up, effective by the time this video comes out, actually. But yeah, this is very interesting for sure. I don't think, however, that these will be popular. The OCG actually has these at 3 already, and these are usually not played. And that's because the existence of the mirror match makes these cards a lot worse than they might initially seem. And so when you're deck building, definitely consider the fact that like the mirror match is also one that you would want to prepare for. And we still have Fuwanaris over here for sure. So like cards like this that are less effective into those matchups might not see play, definitely in the main deck at least. Shifter is also one that is obviously very strong against tier, but I think this is probably enough if you want to have like floodgatey type effects for banishing. But this is something I thought I'd just kind of talk about briefly here. Next up is actually a very interesting one. That's a Pointer of the Red Lotus. So OCG actually has this at 3. And the reason why this is good in this deck as a side deck choice is that with a Rise Heart, you can actually just take the card that you just banished from their hand and just make it so they can never get it back. And so that's like really powerful at just taking away their powerful side deck card, their board breaker, or if they don't have one, just their best engine piece and tucking that under the Rise Heart and making it useless basically. So this card being at 1 actually does matter for this deck because it means you can't like trap trick it out or anything. So I wonder if Konami actually hit this very early on, kind of with this deck in mind. But in any case, this being still an option is maybe something to think about. It is treatable with the triple tactic tasking card if you get hand traps, so that's something to also think about. But yeah, this card has pretty cool incidental synergy. You can also play cards like Siphon Mode Omega if you want to play like Effect Veiler to try and synchro summon into that. It seems less reliable than this card, but it definitely is a play. Next up are some cooler techs. I'm actually a fan of both of these cards. So Forbidden Lance and Sarvis, the Ancient and Ascended. These are both cards that are used to help kind of combat targeted cards against this card or against this deck, because this deck has a lot of like ways that you can sideboard to beat it. I keep mentioning Book of Eclipse, but like even cards like Sulliek going second are kind of hard to deal with. Because if you summon Unicorn and then they just Sulliek you, it can sometimes actually be enough to just stop your play entirely. So these cards can kind of help deal with it. They both have different ranges of usage. Lance can cover Book of Eclipse most notably, It can cover like Dark Ruler, and protect one of your monsters from Dark Ruler. That is, it can help you against just other spells and traps that might try and take control of your stuff. Things like Mind Control and Change of Heart, and Triple Tactics Talent. Most notably, Triple Tactics Talent is something that this card covers that Sarvis doesn't. Sarvis can, of course, cover anything that does target. So it does include these cards, but not Book of Eclipse. But it does include like Effect Veiler and Ghost Mourner, which Mourner is a lot more popular in the OCG just because it functions differently. But we could see Mourner still see play here. But yeah, both of these cards kind of fulfill similar roles. Notably, Sarvis is a 7, so if you play Sacred Sword, you can use this sort of as like fodder if you wanted to. And it's also a dragon, meaning it's searchable off of Magnamut. So that is something to think about, although historically Bistiols and the Kashtira cards don't work the greatest together, just because, especially in the pure version or like the dedicated Kashtira deck, you need your main monster zones to be empty. So you definitely don't want this clogging when you have just a bunch of Kashtira stuck in your hand and you don't have birth access. But the fact that it's searchable off Magnamut is pretty cool. I personally like Lance a bit more, just because pretty much almost every OCG side deck is playing Book of Eclipse right now, and I feel like if those trends fall into the TCG, you definitely would want this card as sort of a hedge against Book of Eclipse specifically. So yeah, this is definitely something to think about for sure. So next, I'm going to talk about some counters for this deck if you are interested in playing against this deck, or if you want to prepare for like the mirror match, for example. So I mentioned Book of Eclipse probably 50 times in this video. So this card, if you are unfamiliar, it changes all face-up monsters in the field to face-down defense position. And then during the end phase of the turn, they get flipped face up, and then your opponent draws cards equal to the number of monsters that are changed face up by this effect. So this card is a way to just blanket book everything on the board. It turns off the macro, it turns off the zone locking, so all of your zones are now free. And it turns off the Fenrir Unicorn that they're summoning in the standby phase. So this card pretty much shuts off the entire board by itself. One thing is you could play Swords of Concealing Light, which is another option. The problem with Concealing Light is that they can actually just chain the Arise Heart to banish this on activation. So this card is pretty much better in most cases. The one thing that this does lose to is Ash Blossom, which is why some people were testing with Book of Lunar Eclipse. But in any case, being able to just book the field is extremely solid and is one way to just clear the entire threat on the field. If your deck can accommodate Sphere Mode and Lava Golem, that's effectively the same thing as well. You can just hit the most prevalent threats on the board and just go about your day. Lava Golem, you will still have to deal with something, whether it be between, that is, the Shangri-La, the Arise Heart, or the Fenrir. Typically, that's going to be the 3 major threats. So you'll have to deal with something still with Lava Golem, but at least you get rid of like the majority of it, and you can keep playing. Regeki is interesting, as well as Evenly Match. I guess these kind of go together more so than Dark Ruler, but these sorts of board wipes are interesting. So the Shangri-La will stay on the board in the case of Regeki. And in the case of Evenly Match, they're going to be able to keep 1. So if your deck loses to a Rise Heart, this doesn't really help solve the problem. But if you only need to deal, or if you can deal with like only 1 threat, for example, you don't mind your opponent having still some board presence left, these can be options for sure. And then Dark Ruler can help shut off everything but the Shangri-La, which is pretty good. The Shangri-La zone blocking, that is. So yeah, those are definitely some things to think about. The change control cards being Mind Con, Change of Heart, Triple Tactics Talent, Enemy Controller can be in this list as well. These are all really good as well. And for sure, I think some of these will see play to some extent. In the mirror match, especially, again, because of the interaction with the Arise Heart, you're getting a lot of mileage out of just taking their Shangri-La or taking whatever after the Shangri-La activates, and then just putting an Arise Heart over it. And that is a very big swing or momentum that is hard to recover from if you're on the receiving end of it. So definitely like these cards a lot. Triple Tactic Tasking is another one. It kind of just is a way to be able to fetch out any of like these types of cards if they play into it, which they will be able to play, or they will play into it, mostly because the Rise Heart's mandatory, or like they want to use Shangri-La standby phase effects, etc. So this is a very, very solid card that is also coming in for Hypernova. So definitely one that people are already aware of, and is one that will be probably present at least to some degree. A lot of OCG players actually side deck 1 copy of this just as like another copy of whatever they want to have, which is definitely something we could see over here in the TCG as well. Imperm I discussed already kind of as like a negation type card against Shangri-La specifically, but this card's also good at negating stuff like Unicorn because it doesn't trigger the Unicorn effect, which is something that like Ash Blossom falls prey to, for example. Like Ash Blossom and Papias, while this is on board, I already mentioned, it kind of makes it so you Reaper yourself. So definitely things to think about when like you're hand trapping this deck is that like you would have to potentially play into like a Unicorn or a Fenrir, depending on if you have like a board with like engine hand traps, for example. But yeah, hand traps I don't think are the greatest against this deck. They're definitely not terrible, but I think the board breakers here in terms of impact are much stronger. Reaper is an interesting choice. OCG likes Reaper a lot right now, just because without the existence of Guerrero, Tearlaments has a much harder time struggling, or they have a much harder time against a Reaper calling Kakalos, because they don't have like a backup like Guerrero into Abyssal into Beatrice play, or like Guerrero into Dark Take, Reaper into like a sprint type of play. They're recently starting to play Muddragon to help counteract that in like a similar fashion, but us having Guerrero makes Reaper a bit more shaky against that deck, and you see that like this card is not really as popular as it was early on in the format because people started figuring out the ways to beat this card. But if you are playing Reaper and if you want to splash in whichever of the Kashtira extra deck monsters that you think is necessary or appropriate, this is definitely an option. And I touched on Nibiru earlier briefly, but Nibiru is definitely something that is worth watching out for if it ever does become relevant again. Again, right now it's not seeing play just because of the current meta trends being Rukulos, Gigantic Spray, and Fuonderies existing. But in any meta where this deck is prevalent and Nibiru happens to be good, Nibiru is good against this deck. Because this deck really does not have a native way to really deal with this card. And it would probably force players to play like Cross Designator if that ends up being the case. But some other techs in the extra deck as well. I actually forgot to mention these. So we have first off Big Eye, which and Dracosac. I guess these all go together. Big Eye, Dracosac, and the Dark Armed. I think these are pretty standard, as is Flare Metal. I think most players will probably play all of these, or at least most of them, because they all have good utility. Because this can work really well in like the mirror match, kind of like similar to the Mind Control and the Change of Heart. You can go like Dracosac into a Zeus play, which is actually something that the Tearlaments deck does even. Like they just play this card with like Fenrir and Tearlaments Kashtira to go into this. Dark Armed is actually cool in this deck because not only is it not a once per turn pop, but it also allows you to go ahead and banish a card from your graveyard on resolution of this effect. So you can actually banish a card like Papias and get the effect off, which is very, very solid. It's something that actually has come up for me in testing before. So definitely something to consider. And the Flare Metal is not only like a time card, but it actually is good to just close out the game if you have a lot of big beaters, but you can't necessarily pull off lethal. This is kind of a masquerade at home, if you will, but it actually is pretty solid as well because it can't be destroyed by card effects, so it has Xyz material. So definitely is a decent kind of like backup play in those cases where it does happen. Donner I briefly mentioned already as a way to kind of just clear threats as well as clearing your own board. It's basically Diamond Direwolf in a Link monster, but the fact that this clears itself is really, really good. Asa is probably going to be popular because the mirror match will exist, or decks splashing Fenrir such as Tearlaments will exist. So you just probably want ways to be able to utilize this to your advantage. And it is very solid in that regard. Next up we have Baron. This is popular in the OCG because a lot of their lists play Mourner and Ash. So you can go ahead and normal summon one of those hand traps and make a Baron to play, which is especially good post side to help counteract those side cards. Some other interesting cool options that I haven't touched on yet are Harmonizer Gradiel. I think this card's cool because it has a lot of unique effects that are pretty decent against tier. So its attribute is treated as not only light, but also the material or the attributes of the materials that are attached to it. And it also can't be destroyed by battle with a monster of that attribute or the activated effects of monsters with the same attribute as this card. And then as a quick effect, you can target a monster in the graveyard and then attach that monster to this card as material by detaching one. So this is very good against tier. Just you can chain this to a tier activation, and then it kind of is sort of like a DD Crow-esque effect. So yeah, this card is a consideration for sure because it's just a generic requiring 2 materials. In some cases, it can come up and it can help you play around like Havness and stuff. And then I already touched on these cards. The last one is Infernal Goliath, which is very interesting. This is a card you can banish with Pot of Prosperity, and then it gives you Xyz monsters whose original types are machine the ability to be indestructible by card effects, which means that if you banish this off Prosperity and you reattach it with a Rise Heart to it, this card is a machine, so it actually gives itself the protection effect. So you can help play around cards like Pearl Rhino or like Regeki if that comes down to it. So this is definitely something that I think is worth considering because the extra deck space is not super tight in this deck, so you can definitely make use of it. If you're playing Ibli, you probably want to play either Almirage or Lingeriba, but I think that's pretty self-explanatory as well. So now I'm going to go over some sample deck lists. I have 3 sample ones from the OCG. So this is a week 1 build, so right when the cards initially came out, and I'll just switch this to OCG mode. So you can kind of see why there's like 2 Shifter and 2 Prosperity in this list, because they're at 2. But I think this is what a very solid like week 1 build would look like. You can see there's a lot of extenders that eventually get cut down on later on in the builds. But having a lot of extenders is good to make sure that you beat hand traps. We can see like a lot of flex spots. We have 11 hand traps here. We have cross out call by, which is kind of like the OCG kind of like staple, if you will. And then some triple tactics talent as well to help facilitate going second, or if you get hand trapped as well. And there's nothing like too flashy at all in this deck. This is what I would think is like a pretty stock standard list. You can see that they are indeed playing the triple pointer because this card again is very synergistic with just a Rise Heart. But yeah, there's pretty much nothing like crazy to highlight given everything we talked about so far in this one. But I think that as a week 1 build, this is like a really good basis to go off of for your own list. So moving on into a week 3 build. So this one has made some innovations. This one has made the innovations to play Barrier Statue and Planet Pathfinder, which we kind of talked about. Another thing that they have in the OCG that we don't have here is the Galaxy Tomahawk. This card is pretty cool, and in the OCG they were using it to do a combo to go into a Rival Cybers at Ignister, which is kind of like how a lot of people are thinking about in the TCG with IP into Avermax. Like they were making some similar considerations with this. If we had this card, it would be very cool, but we do not have this card. Honestly, that's probably for the better. But something I thought it was worth highlighting. But yeah, this also highlights the fact that you see like the idea of like cycling into field spells with the Planet Pathfinder. You could also play Metaverse, which is now at 3. Like so, those are things to sort of think about. This list isn't playing Tearlaments Kashtira, but there are definitely lists that are. So just something to note there. And we see the Swords of Concealing Light here, but again, we already touched on why this card maybe it's not as good as the Book of Eclipse, but the list just so happened to play it. Most of the lists, if you look at Road to the King, which I'll credit also in the description below, where you can find all these lists, by the way, they were mostly playing Book of Eclipse for sure. And then this is a very recent build from this past week, actually, at the time of me recording this video, being a week 6 build, so they've had this for a month and a half. But yeah, you can see they actually cut down on Fenrir to 2, which I'm not sure is a trend that will continue to happen moving forward. But it is definitely something that's interesting because this card, again, is worse to draw than Unicorn as just a pure play starter, but it is still one of the better cards overall in the deck. So I'm not 100% sure if I agree with this choice, but another thing you see here is the Ogre and the Preparations package in here. I say it's the package, but just like the small kind of like engine, if you will. I think that this definitely is worth exploring and is worth testing around with, because there are definitely situations where having also like just an additional body to summon is nice because you rotate through your names pretty quickly if you open multiple engine pieces. So just having another like way to get additional plus is also appreciated. But apart from that, nothing too crazy. We see the Lance here in the main deck as well, and like I mentioned, I'm a pretty big fan of Lance, so I think that this will potentially see quite a lot of play here in the TCG as well. OCG also, again, they like Reaper a lot, so they're going to be playing this card. And in the extra deck, nothing too crazy. They're also playing the Draco Feature package, which is something that maybe can come up. Probably not a whole ton, but it is something maybe is worth playing. And they're also playing this card, the Volofernijas. I do not know how to pronounce this card, but this card is very interesting. It's kind of like a mini Dark Armed, like where it just destroys face-up cards in the field. So it's like an out to floodgates and stuff. So yeah, this is a pretty straightforward list. Something to note with Kit Callus as well is that I saw a build very early on playing Instant Fusion in this deck, in the Kashtira deck, to summon Kit Callus, and then that can search the Tearlaments Kashtira. So that's something to maybe consider. I don't think it's like that crazy, but it's something that at least one person was experimenting with in the OCG. And they were also playing Reaper, of course, in their side deck. But then here, finally, is kind of like a sample TCG list, like that I would consider playing. Here is like the list I was testing for a little bit. I haven't tested super extensively with this deck, but there are some interesting things to note here, being that I'm testing 3-Birth. This, again, is more standard at 2 copies, but just the ability to play 3 hand traps better and also just have like lingering follow-up is very nice. I'm like testing siding the Ogre into the preparations package just because I think it's good. Book of Eclipse should probably be in the side deck somewhere, but I kind of threw the side deck together pretty quickly, so I haven't really done extensive testing with like patterns and stuff. But overall, I think this is also like a pretty decent template. Like we have more room for like triple prosperity, triple shifter, which the OCG doesn't have, so like we can play around with those cards more. But other than that, there's not a whole lot to explain here. I think everything else was already covered. So thanks guys for watching this video. Again, stay tuned for the other installments that are going to be coming soon for this guide. The next one is going to be a bit of a combo tutorial. This deck's not really a combo-y combo deck as other traditional combo decks would be, but there only still are plays that you might want to think about depending on what cards you open and what cards you're trying to play around. So we'll be going over those in that video. But again, that's going to be it. Thanks guys for watching, and until next time, I will catch you in the next video. See you guys!